Hi everyone, it's Sarah and welcome to Module 2. Today we're going to be talking about style. And essentially it's going to be a very quick overview of really the history of art, looking at how style changed. And what you'll notice is that every art historical period is really a reaction to the one that came before it. So it's constantly changing. Artists are constantly thinking about what came before them and how really to depict the world around them in a style that reflects their own time period. So at the end of this module, you'll be able to look at a work of art and really place it within the context of art history simply by looking at the style. And I'll give you certain keys to how to analyze actually any work of art that you approach. Last week we talked about medium. That's the kind of first thing you want to think about when looking at a work of art. And now we're going to look at the style and the content of it. So you can start to understand what it is that you like and start to determine what it is that your taste is. We're going to start with the Renaissance because that's really when figurative art takes off, I guess. And before this, in medieval art, figures are very static. They're not naturalistic. So this all changes in the middle of the 15th century. And this is a work by Giotto. I'm not really going to mention any artist names this week, but I am going to mention Giotto because he was incredibly influential in the history of art. He is the first artist to demonstrate emotion in art. And his work really signifies this transition from medieval art to Renaissance art. And it's in many ways, I hate to use the word revolutionary, but it's very, very significant. So let's look at this work and kind of pick apart what makes it transitional, what is medieval about it, and what is really new about it. So the first thing is the perspective. You have a very flattened image. The way that he creates perspective is by overlapping various figures. You don't really get a great sense of depth here, which is how, during the Middle Ages, the artists created compositions and images. It was by overlapping figures to give a sense of depth. However, here you'll see that he imbues this image with an incredible sense of emotion. Mary is holding Christ. She looks down. You can see the pain in her face. Certain people surrounding them, clasp their hands together by their face in grief. They spread their arms. The woman sitting by his feet cradles his feet, visibly distraught. The angels above the little putti, they are very dramatic, in fact, in the way that they express emotion. So all of this was very new. Nobody had ever seen this kind of emotion before. And so it's this transitional phase where you start to see something new in art. And that's really built upon in the 15th century. So as we get into Renaissance art, perspective develops a little bit. Here you have a one-point perspective where you have a perspective point way back at the end of the church, in the middle of the church, and all the lines move towards that. So what it does is opens up the composition a lot. So you get to see things that are a bit more expansive. You still have some figures that overlap one another, but you have a defined foreground, middle ground, and background. And in Renaissance art, during the Renaissance, also what happened was there was this renewed interest in classicism. So here you have figures dressed in classical attire. You have architecture that is based upon the Roman period. And all of that is brought to the forefront again during the Renaissance. You also have really beautiful portraits done of various women, of various men, in their clothing, in their classic attire. Here's a woman with a pharaoh. Anything that they were holding would have represented a part of their personality. So here you see the woman. I should say this is also much more naturalistically rendered than anything that would have been done during the Middle Ages. So in the Renaissance, you get this renewed naturalism, again, interest in classical subject matter, development with perspective. You also get to see mythological subject matter coming back into play. So here you see the three graces dancing around. There's all this renewed interest in classical themes. And I should say, all of these works that we've seen so far have been in Italy. In the north, there is also, painting changes a lot as well, but it's slightly different. So let's take a look at a few examples from the north. Here's an example. This was an engagement portrait between this couple. As we talked about last week, we looked at an example from the north and how the use of oil really revolutionized and changed painting in Northern Europe, especially in the Netherlands. And here you get to see that again. So you have this man in very rich fur clothing. You have the little dog in front. You have the woman again in this beautiful green dress with all of the folds meticulously rendered. You have the chandelier, which is made out of brass. You have a convex mirror in the background. So all of this is the artist illustrating how talented he is and rendering different materials within a painting itself. And there was really a focus and appreciation for this kind of work. Again, you see a portrait here from a northern artist. It's really beautiful in how he's able to show how see-through the piece of cloth on her head is. So again, a interest in the texture of the items itself in Northern Renaissance painting. You can see her hair, she has it covered. Her silk belt, the little gold or brass buckle that she has, her rings on her finger, doesn't have that sfumato effect that some of the Italian portrait that we looked at had. Sfumato means that it's sort of hazy, not as crisp and clear, but nonetheless there is this interest in doing portraits. So after the Renaissance period, you have the Baroque period. And the Baroque period originated in Rome. It really takes place from the very, very late years of the 16th century through the early 18th century. And it, like Renaissance and many of the other periods we'll look at today, it included painting, sculpture, architecture. And it was after this time of the Renaissance where there was this idealism, everything was very structured. Baroque art was really all about movement and an even greater sense of emotion. It's incredibly tied to the historical period because there were a lot of religious tensions during this time with the Counter-Reformation. And so the Catholic Church called upon its artists to really make large-scale works of art, like monumental wall paintings, huge frescoes, and then also other paintings that really reflected and was able to assert the power of the Catholic Church. So in this you get an incredible sense of movement. When you think of Baroque art, think about movement. This is a work by an Italian artist. I will mention his name. His name is Caravaggio. I mention it because he's very unique in the sense that he created this style called tenebrism. Excuse me, I'm thinking of the Italian term tenebrismo, but tenebrism, which is this very intense light and focusing on the figures with a very dark background. So this is Judith and Holofernes. And this is a very graphic image, but you can see that it's a very dynamic image. There is action taking place. Unlike some of the other images we looked at where you had men and women standing essentially in Renaissance art, whether it was the engaged couple or you had St. Peter receiving the key to Rome, where all of the figures were standing in a line. Here there's action. There's really movement and engagement between the various people in the image. Here's another example. Again, you still have classical figures. Classicism is still important during this time period. However, again, there's not that static energy between people. There's a movement. So the soldier lifts the women up in the air. Their clothes are flying in the wind. It's a completely different style and completely different way of depicting figures in art. Again, here you have these very robust female figures. Every figure in this painting is engaged with one another. They're touching one another. They're all connected in this way. Even the horse in the background, they're all moving together as one almost. Each movement affects another. And that's really what you want to think about when you're looking at Baroque art, is this incredible sense of movement and dynamism. Baroque art morphs into Rococo art. So Rococo is really the beginning of the 18th century. And where in the Baroque period you had very rich colors, you had very intense, almost overly so, depictions of movement. In the Rococo period, that settles down a little bit, but there's still this, there's still interactions between the figures, but mostly it's a light-hearted depiction of domestic life in upper-class homes. There are courting scenes. You see elegantly dressed aristocrats at play, usually in pastoral landscapes. It's all about courting and beauty and romance and fun and playfulness, and there's lots of sexual symbols, sexuality involved in the pictures as well. Think of Marie Antoinette, that she kind of embodies what the Rococo period was in art, if you think of her as a historical figure. So here you have a domestic scene. In Rococo art, the colors are usually very light, pastel almost. So you have an aristocratic family here sitting around the table eating breakfast, it looks like, looking at one another. And it's just a very intimate, sweet scene. This is a very famous image of the period where you have this woman very, really kind of flirting with the gentleman below on the swing. Her shoe flies off, her skirt, opens up. It's very characteristic of the Rococo period. You see her in her light pink dress. She has almost two suitors, one who is behind her, swinging her, and the other who is below her. So it's very characteristic of Rococo art. Here's another image where you have a group of men and women really courting one another, and here they are out in a pastoral landscape. So a very idyllic, perfect, intimate landscape. After the Rococo period, at around 1750, there's a switch. And you enter a period of neoclassical art. And neoclassical art is really defined as a severe and unemotional form of art, which goes back again to the grandeur of ancient Greece and Rome. So the influence of Greece and Rome since the Renaissance, it never really goes away, but it has periods where it is more important than others. And really there's this renewed interest around 1750. because this is around the time when Pompeii is discovered, Herculaneum in Italy is also discovered. So there's this renewed interest in classicism. So the rigidity of the neoclassical style is really a reaction to the Rococo style and the very emotional Baroque style. And the rise of neoclassical art was in part of, as I said, just a general revival of interest in classical thought, which was also placing it in historical context, important in the American and French revolutions. So here again, you get to see this is a more severe composition. So you have a classical setting with these rounded arches, men and women in classical attire, but it's very static. So there's not the men, they're standing there, they're saluting this other gentleman in the red robe, and there's a severeness to it, there's a harshness to it, there's a rigidity to their stances where they're not in movement. You also see that there are kind of blocks in these neoclassical works of art where you have the three figures in the front, which is one group together, and then you have another group of women on the right, which is another group together, and you get these kind of groups and these groups of people. Here's another example, again, mythological subject matter and renewed interest in classical subject matter, and also a bit more restrained than what was being made in the beginning of the 18th century. Here is the last example of neoclassical art. At the very end of the 19th century, you start to see Egyptian and other more exotic subject matter being brought in. So you have a sort of sphinx-like figure up there on the left. Part of this was, of course, when Napoleon comes into power in the 1800s and begins to start taking over so many different countries. Very ineloquent historical analysis, but I'm sure you know what I mean. So this was done in 1808. As you can see on the rock, he has 1808 down there. So it was during Napoleon's time. And if you look at neoclassical furniture as well, you see a great influence of the Egyptian style. So around 1800 and in the beginning of the 1800s, there is a shift yet again to Romanticism. So like everything else, Romanticism was a reaction against the neoclassical. So you had emotion, you had movement, you had playfulness in the Baroque and the Rococo periods. You have this Stoicism in the neoclassical period. And again, you have Romanticism now reacting against that Stoicism. And it was a bit more emotional. The sublime is you often see in landscapes. There's just a bit more feeling to it. So here's a landscape where you can see this very bright light. You can see into the distance. Even though it's a landscape, there is the way that they use color really highlights and emphasizes the emotional impact of the landscape itself. You begin to start to see everyday subject matter or subject matter that was in the news being brought to light in some of these images. You also, as I said, with Napoleon's conquests, there's a greater interest in Eastern art as well. So you get to see examples of, they say, Orientalism influencing the Romantic period. Here, this was based on an actual news story of a shipwreck, and how they survived. So it's you see that emotion, you see the way the bodies interact with one another. They're exaggerated in how they reach towards one another. There's emotion there, which really wasn't apparent in neoclassical art. After realism, after romanticism, you go into realism. And again, so there's this constant movement between emotion and restraint in art, and within that, looking at the world around them and figuring out how to depict the world around them within the constraints of the style of the time. So in realism, it's really a French movement. It began in the 1840s and continued late into the 19th century, and it wanted to convey a very truthful and objective vision of contemporary life. So not this, which was really meant to affect how the viewer was analyzing this news event of this shipwreck. The viewer is meant to feel emotion. They're meant to feel sorrow for the men who have died, and to feel that anxiety of the men who still remain. But in realism, it's an objective and truthful vision of what's happening around them. And it emerged in the aftermath of the Revolution of 1848, which overturned the monarchy of Louis Philippe. And it was developed during the period of the Second Empire under Napoleon III. And French society, they were fighting for democratic reform, and the realists democratized art by depicting modern subjects drawn from the everyday lives of the working class. Prior to this, or during this whole period, there was a system in place in France as well as England called the Salon system, where once a year there was a big exhibit, and the public could go in and see art that was made in the past year. And the art was ranked. So historical paintings, like the ones that we saw, like this painting, for example, would have been the most highly prized work of art. And landscapes, portraiture, still lifes, other kind of art just was not believed to be as worthy. So the fact that these artists are now depicting everyday life was quite revolutionary, and they really rejected that idealized classicism that came to be during neoclassical art, and the exotic themes that we saw in romanticism, and it's based on a very direct observation of the modern world. So here we have a country scene where you have real women from that time period depicted in their everyday life. Here you see a funeral, and it's very harsh in its depiction. It's a realistic portrayal of perhaps what a funeral would have looked like. And lastly, here's an image of women working in the fields. So it was really meant to be the everyday life of French people and elevating that to the status of a historical painting, which was very revolutionary and not very well received by the academics and the leading scholars and art historians of the time. So now we're going to talk about Impressionism. And the Impressionists were radicals during their time. To contemporary viewers, we're so used to seeing Impressionist art everywhere, and it's often someone's favorite art historical period because it's very pleasing to the eye, the colors, the brushstrokes. However, when it began in the mid to late 19th century, it was not appreciated by the Salon and by the Academy and anyone really involved in academic painting. And it wasn't because they constructed their pictures from very freely brushed colors that took precedence over lines and contours. So here in this example, you see how thick and kind of chunky the lines are. You can really see the brushstrokes. It's not super realistic. They also painted scenes from modern life. So here you have a harbor scene. And they painted outdoors. So they developed a system called en plein air. My French is terrible. But essentially it means that they would take their canvas, and they would go outside, they'd take their paints, they'd take their easel, and they'd set up and they'd paint outside. And they were interested in a moment, as opposed to these very thought out compositions that you see previously in academic paintings, these history paintings. Here they want a snapshot of life. So here you have a very specific moment of a sunset. That's why you see Monet also do multiple compositions of haystacks, the Rouen Cathedral, because he's interested in how light changes the impression of a single space. So they're very interested in light, they're very interested in color. Here's another example where you see this everyday life. The bourgeoisie was coming to life at this time in France, so here are members of the bourgeoisie out dancing, enjoying themselves. Again, you have an interest in light, you have larger brushstrokes, more visible brushstrokes. It's capturing really this moment in time. And lastly, here's another image by Degas, some of his ballerinas. Around this time too, you have photography being developed, so that plays into this idea of capturing a moment. And here you'll see in how the violinist is cut off halfway through, Degas especially really starts to mirror his compositions based on how a photograph would take, where it cuts off certain things, and it's not so perfectly organized. So it was very modern, in fact. And after the Impressionists, you have what's called Post-Impressionism. And it's, again, a predominantly French art movement, which really developed between the 1880s and the very early 1900s. Impressionism began around the 1860s through the 1880s. And Post-Impressionism emerged as a reaction to the Impressionists. So like every art movement, they're always looking at what came before them, and these young artists are saying, okay, how can we do things a little bit differently? And they were really going against the Impressionist concern for a more naturalistic depiction of light and color. And what's really interesting about Post-Impressionism is that it's the first time where you really get a very wide range of distinct artistic styles. And they all share a common motivation of responding to the Impressionist movement, but they do so in different ways. So here's an example of pointillism. We have the artist who is depicting a normal day at the park, like the previous work we saw here. Subject matter is similar, however, he's doing it by painting tiny, tiny little dots on the canvas, and this is an enormous canvas. And here's another example of a work. Post-Impressionists became much more focused on abstract form. So sorry to keep jumping around, but again, here you see the form itself is not very realistic. There's this sort of geometric form of each of the women. They're sort of circles or bubbles. It's not very realistic. Here you have a landscape, you have a mountain, and you have a town in the foreground. And they're very geometrically rendered, very sharp angles. Here you have very wide brushstrokes. And again, the Post-Impressionists were focused on moving towards a more abstract form, and they really paved the way for a more radical modernist exploration of abstraction when you get into the early 20th century. So critics grouped the various styles within Post-Impressionism in two groups. So there was that structured geometric style, which we saw with the previous works, and then there's also this more expressive style. And the structured works lead into Cubism, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the more expressive works lead into Post-Expressionism in the middle of the 20th century. And here's a work by Van Gogh. And he was really the post-impressionist that expressed emotion in his work. Anytime you look at any of his works, the brushstrokes, the colors, they all evoke a more emotional, dynamic viewing of a certain subject. So here are some irises. It's a field of flowers, but in the way that he depicts the leaves and the flowers and how they interact with one another, there's feeling in this that's very different from any other. If you think of the still life that we looked at last week, it's a very different feeling to it. And this leads into many other modern movements. And lastly, my last note on Post-Impressionism is that it's really important because it's the first movement in which there's this idea of moving away from the painting as a window onto the world and a very traditional way to becoming a window into the artist's mind and soul. So you get to see these more specialized artistic movements that are really tied to the artist's own identity. From Post-Impressionism, we move into the 20th century and we begin to see all these little mini movements, mini artistic movements, and I'm not going to have time to talk about all of them today, but I want to highlight some of the most important ones. Fauvism was the first 20th century movement in modern art, which was inspired by works by Van Gogh, which we just looked at, by Seurat and by Cézanne. We looked at all of those works, also by Paul Gauguin. And they were a loosely allied group of French painters who shared a similar interest. And their interest was in separating color from its descriptive, representational purpose and allowing it to exist on the canvas as an independent element. So color was projecting mood, it was establishing a structure within the work of art without having to be true to the natural world. So we see that in this work. Here's a portrait of a man. He has green down the center of his face, certainly not realistic. The two sides of his face are different colors. We see these blocks of colors, and the Fauvists are really concerned also with a balance. So they used very simple forms, as we see here, highly saturated colors that really drew attention to the flatness of a work. So there's not much depth here. It's very flat. It's very simple in a way. It's really just a few blocks of different colors that come together to represent this figure of a man. And overall, there is a balance between colors too that makes it unified, and that makes it a very strong image. And Fauvis, again, valued individual expression. So the artist's direct experience of his subjects, his emotional response to them, that's all illustrated in the work itself, really through color. So here's another example of that, where you see very highly saturated colors, blocks of colors, not naturalistic, it's very flat, yet somehow it all kind of works together, and all of this is meant to evoke a really emotional response in the viewer. Another movement that begins at the early 20th century was Cubism, and Cubism is one of the first truly modern movements to emerge in art, along with Fauvism. And it really came to be thanks to the work of Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. So as we looked at geometric forms kind of beginning in Post-Impressionism, here the use of geometric forms, flat forms, and a loss of perspective really comes to be in Cubism. So they abandoned perspective, which artists had used to order space since the Renaissance. If you remember, we looked back at that work of art of Peter receiving the keys, and there's a cityscape in the background, and there are these lines, and you can see the lines in the ground itself leading back to that one perspective point in the back of the painting. Here, all of that is gone. And you get a manner of representing bodies in space that employed small, tilted planes and set in a really, really shallow space. So you get these very angular forms of women, very flat. Again, there's a flatness to the painting like Fauvism. The colors are not as highly saturated by any means, but you're really moving towards a more abstract way of depicting figures. Here's another example. It's actually a detail of an example. It's a woman playing a guitar. So you can kind of still make out the figure a little bit, but again, it's like he took the figure and then just sort of flattened it and moved it forward and created this really abstract way of looking at a form in 3 dimension and bringing it to a 2-dimensional plane and really focusing on the two dimensions of a painted figure. Another movement, and the last one we're really going to talk about before we get to 1950, is Futurism. So along with many of these movements, they would write manifestos. So it's really interesting because they were very highly aware, whereas in the past, perhaps, the way that style evolved, it was kind of natural, and you see them all reacting to what came before them. There was more of a sense that it was this natural progression. However, in the early 20th century, you have artists who are very interested in theory and really having a movement, and they would give themselves names. They would give themselves these titles. So futurists were all about celebrating technology and urban modernity. So they were Italian, and they really wanted to illustrate the beauty of modern life, so the beauty of the machine, of speed, of violence and change. So you see really highly dynamic images. So here's a little dog, and they illustrate the way that his legs move, save with the feet of the woman above. So movement is above all important to the futurists. And they were really interested in problems of representing a modern experience. And they wanted their paintings to evoke many different kinds of sensations. So it really wasn't just those that were visible to the modern eye. So that's why you see here again movement moving forward, and it's not necessarily what the eye sees, but it's breaking it down for the viewer so that they can see modernity, they can see technology, machine, and the speed of everything. And they really want to bring to their works noise, the heat, the smell, to give you visually all of those effects of modern life. So like I said, there are many different types of movements in this period. You also have Surrealism, you have Der Blaureiter in Germany, and all of these are modern movements of the same ilk. So again, go to our resources page and really read about them and do some more research to find if there are any in particular that you're really interested in. And before I sign off, I'm going to talk about one more movement, which is abstract expressionism. And this is the beginning of contemporary art. And it began in the early 1940s, primarily in New York. Prior to that, Europe, Paris in particular, had been the center of the art world for a long time. But you get, in the 1940s, a small group of artists who were creating a stylistically diverse body of work that introduced really radical new directions in art. And they were never a formal association like, say, the Futurists who had their manifesto. However, they shared some common assumptions. And their work really came to be because of an exposure and assimilation to European modernism. So in America, in the early 20th century, you looked at some European movements. In America, you have social realism and you have regionalism, and those are the two main movements that were really happening in American art, and they were seen as a bit backwards or not as valuable as the European art at the time. And so these young artists in the 1940s were really looking to Europe to learn about art and to learn really about avant-garde art. So they broke away from the accepted conventions in both technique and subject matter. And their works are monumentally scaled, so that's the first thing they did. They were very, very large works. And they allowed them to stand for their individual psyche. So we talked about how the artist's soul starts to be on the canvas. Beginning with Post-Impressionism, this really comes to be with Abstract Expressionism. And they valued spontaneity and, they really valued spontaneity in art. So here's an example where I feel like I know I said I wasn't going to mention anyone's name, but I feel like I need to because their works are so specific to the artist. So this is a work by Jackson Pollock. Some of you may be familiar with him. He took a canvas, laid it on the floor, and would drip paint on top of it. So again, spontaneity here is really key, and they move from where you have an almost abstract form. This is pretty abstract, but you can kind of tell it's still, there's a machine. Here you can see a dog, even if it's not super naturalistic, and they're focusing on movement and breaking down what the eye can't see to a movement that the eye can see. Here it's pure abstraction. Here's a work by Rothko, and again, there's a focus on abstraction, on how color interacts with one another, and ultimately how this represents the artist himself. And so you get these very individual styles, and that's why when you look at it, you can say immediately, okay, well, this is a Rothko, this is a Pollock, this is a de Kooning. And here you see a figure, but it's still, the emphasis is still really on abstraction and the abstract form. So I'm going to end there. Again, go to the resources section, do your worksheet, turn it in. I'm here for any questions. Please, please, please reach out to me. This is a very quick intro to art history. I hope it gives you some ideas of how things progressed. But again, keep reading, keep learning. This is just a starting point to get you all thinking about, okay, what period am I drawn to? What do I find most interesting visually? So you can start to think about where you might want to consider buying a work of art.